Today our featured guests are Taegan Goddard and Steve Hayes, both incredibly successful media entrepreneurs, specifically in the political news space. I think this is something that we definitely want to talk about, especially as we're starting to head into yet another presidential election. I also wrote a piece yesterday about programmatic advertising and how brands and advertisers are specifically discriminating against political news sites and anything that could be remotely controversial. Obviously, there's a lot of a trend within the general media to move more into subscriptions and memberships in order to shore up that lost advertising revenue. Both Taegan and Steve run very successful subscription/membership programs. So I think there's just a lot of knowledge here to be shared that can be utilized not just by other political media entrepreneurs, but anybody working in the media space, because there's a lot of crossover lessons that we can learn. So Taegan, he's a lot of things, but the thing he's the most known for is the founder of Political Wire, which was one of the original cohort of political blogs. When you think of like the mid 2000s, the rise of the Netroots, Daily Kos, Powerline, Talking Points Memo, Taegan was among that cohort. He created this incredibly popular blog for the first, I think, 10 years or so, monetized it mainly through advertising, and then eventually launched a paid membership program that is really successful. Steve Hayes, if you've watched cable news sometime over the past 20 years, you probably recognize his face. He was a long time on-air contributor to Fox News and then defected from Fox News a few years ago. And I think you're a regular CNN contributor now, Steve?
It's NBC, actually.
Oh, NBC. Oh, is it Jonah that's the CNN?
Jonah's
okay.
CNN. I'm NBC.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. He was also the editor of crap. Why am I blanking on the name of the?
You can't forget it. It's only been gone for 3.5 years. And Matt Reese used to work there too. The Weekly Standard.
The Weekly Standard. I was going to call it the Washington Standard. I don't know why. That shut down because it was owned by some hedge fund billionaire. And then you most recently, in I think 2020, got together with several other center-right conservatives, media, like journalists, and launched the Dispatch, kind of like a magazine / newsletter that originally was hosted on Substack. You were one of the first big publications on Substack, and then eventually, just recently, you moved off it. So I definitely interested in hearing about your reasons for that. So let's jump into the questions itself. Again, when people want to ask questions, just pop into the chat or unmute yourself. But so I guess I want to start off broad because digital media over the past 10 years or so has gotten a lot more polarized. You see, especially on the right, the emergence of media outlets like Ben Shapiro, Breitbart News, Town Hall, these super like pro-Trump kind of far right outlets, and they've kind of benefited by the ecosystem of social media and programmatic advertising, and that they were using outrage to drive clicks. Both of your publications adhere somewhat close to the center. And I would love to just start by hearing your thoughts on that, especially starting with you, Steve, because I remember, in full disclosure, I did a little bit of consulting with Steve in the Dispatch early on. But I remember talking to you and you feeling like there was this spot in the center that wasn't being served, especially on the center right. Did that thesis kind of bear out that there was this huge market of people in that space?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of consulting that was tremendously helpful, if I can just add that. Yeah, I mean, our thought grew out of what we were trying to do at the Weekly Standard. We thought of the Weekly Standard as a sensible place for sort of fact-based arguments, reporting, analysis that covered a certain place in the political spectrum. The way that we conceived it when we went out and sort of pitched to investors was, think of the news media political spectrum from left to right. And if you start in the center and you move to the left, our thesis was it's very densely populated. You can basically stop anywhere from the center going left, and there's a lot of competition there. But if you start in the center and you move to the right, there's this vast open space between the center and sort of halfway to the right. Then there are some publications that do some reporting, are kind of fact-based, really good publications. But then after that, it gets really fringy really fast.
Yeah.
And sort of audience pleasing, rage bait kind of publications that were getting a lot of traffic, making a lot of money in some cases, and driving a lot of the debate. So we basically said we can fit in that slot on the center right, and we did the same exercise on sort of the function of the publication. If you start in the center and you move to the left, and you ask the people running those publications, what is it that you do? Virtually all of them, whether you're talking about the Daily Beast or the Nation, would include in that answer reporting. It would be a core part of what they're doing. If you did the same thing starting in the center and moving to the right, very few of the people running those media outlets would say reporting, or would say reporting first up front. And we thought that was a real big gap for us. And to answer your question directly, I mean, certainly we grew much faster than we thought we would. And I think it owes directly to the fact that market opening that we identified was a lot bigger than we thought it was.
Yeah, and there was this market category called, for better or worse, it was called the Never Trumper. And it seemed like there were a lot of Never Trumpers that, were incredibly influential, these like kind of disaffected Republicans that were incredibly influential on social media. But there wasn't really, other than like, the Weekly Standard was shut down, maybe National Review to a certain extent, although they got a little Trumpy, I feel like, the Bulwark. But you just noticed that there were a lot of these like very influential people who, especially while Trump was in office, like, do you think that the fact that you launched in 2020 was like it would have been different if you had launched after like Trump left office?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, we did our soft launch in October of 2019, and then first put up paywall and asked people to pay us in February of 2020. And we described ourselves sort of at the outset, and again in meetings with people we talked to before we launched, as not as an explicitly never Trump organization, but as a post-Trump organization. Now, that may turn out to be more wishful thinking than we understood at the time, but we didn't want to identify ourselves by our politics primarily, because we're a journalistic institution. The first thing we do is journalism. So we report, we find facts, our analyses are based on facts. We wanted to be a place where people could come and have sort of thoughtful exchanges, including and especially with people they didn't agree with, whether that's sort of Trumpers to our, I don't even know if you can call it to our right, or, friends we have the center left and left. And so we launched with that in mind. But I think what distinguishes us from a place like the Bulwark is just a little more political, like sort of expressly political. And they have people who work there. Some of them are my good friends who also work in politics. They're sort of dual hatted, and we're not. We're a media company first and foremost.
Yeah, I just had Stephen Gutowski on my podcast, who I know you're friends with, and he comes from conservative media, but he has always stayed anchored on the journalism side.
Exactly.
And he's always been respected on the center and center left because of that. And so there is like, I think conservatives are more skeptical of left of center media versus I think liberals, at least the ones that are closer to the center, they're more willing to engage with the center right publication that's doing actual journalism. Taegan, you have kind of like a longer view of kind of digital media in the sense that you came up when there was like the right wing blogosphere, the left wing blogosphere. Like, you're relatively close to the center. Do you feel like, you're at any kind of disadvantage when so much of social media is driven around clicks? Like, where do you feel like you've kind of carved out your niche and are able to like maintain your audience?
So it's a great question. The premise of Political Wire has always been, so when I was back in college, which will tell you a little bit of how old I am, I used to get the Wall Street Journal, which was my favorite publication. I used to wait for the Friday edition to come out, and on the right-hand column, there was a column called Washington Wire, and I just devoured that every Friday. I loved it. I thought it was just the greatest thing in the world. And what it was a reporting out of their Washington bureau, just little nuggets of interesting things that had happened, most of which had not really happened, had not really made their main coverage that week, but it was always fascinating. There was, sometimes a little gossipy, here's what we're hearing, here's what we see, but mostly it was just interesting facts, interesting tidbits that just didn't make a story, but made this column. And Washington Wire was a feature the Wall Street Journal actually introduced. I think it was back right after World War II in the late 1940s, and so it was continuously running for quite a long time. Essentially, what I wanted to do with Political Wire was replicate that, but not be limited to one publication's Washington, D.C. bureau, might be much broader in my outlook of sources. And so it was good timing for me, because with the internet, all of a sudden, and when I started this, it was back at a time when most newspapers didn't really have their full newspapers up online. So this is back in the late 1990s. Actually, the predecessor to Political Wire was called Political Insider. And my good friend, Chris Rebeck, who's on this call, the two of us did that together starting back in 1997. And so, that's the very, very early days of the internet. The Des Moines Register, for instance, did not have their full newspaper up online. They only had parts of it, occasional stories. But what we did in Political Insider for a couple of years with a daily briefing, and then Political Wire became kind of like a 24/7 thing, was essentially find these interesting stories that are out there that anyone who's interested in following politics would be interested in. Okay, so if you're probably most of the people who are on this call, or anybody who really follows politics, it really wasn't driven by left or right. It was driven by, this is an important story, you should probably know about it. So the lead post right now as we talk on Political Wire is that the full audio was released from Oklahoma, of these Oklahoma officials discussing lynchings of Black people and murdering journalists. So this very small newspaper, interestingly enough, that newspaper is still not fully online. They have released via YouTube the audio of this discussion, where the Republican governor of Oklahoma has come out and demanded their resignations. It's become quite a story in Oklahoma, but in my view, it's a national story. It's something that we need to be aware of, and it's no more than one sentence linking to the full audio. I'll let readers consume it, understand it. There's a way to comment on the site, but I'm pretty much bringing it to their attention. That's something that in their normal course of their reading of political media, they might not come across necessarily, but as the day goes on and as the week goes on, I try to put up interesting postings that kind of, inform a little bit about politics. So I'll frequently link to pieces from the Dispatch, when they make some interesting points, or publications, obviously the New York Times or CNN or some blog or a YouTube video or a tweet. So when I started this, the idea of Political Wire broadening the sources that it used, the sources have just exploded. And in some ways, it's actually been a good thing for me, because people rely on my editorial judgment to tell them, is this something I should be looking at? Is this something that's interesting to me? Is this not, rather than just some random tweet by somebody that you don't know, they can come here and they can say, Political Wire says this is legit, this is okay. And for the most part, I get it right. And when I don't get it right, I pretty much find out really quickly that I didn't get it right, and I can correct it. That's the other beautiful thing about digital media.
So it sounds like the insight, just to kind of summarize, is like that you had is similar to what like Jim Vandehei and Mike Allen figured out when they left Politico, was that like mainstream media was doing like a really poor job of servicing political junkies. This kind of like almost like a sports fan, like cohort within America that doesn't want the just like top line stuff. They actually want to drill down and find, all these political nuggets that are going along in both local and national politics. And that was just kind of completely underserved by like the low metabolism, slow mainstream media. And you kind of figured out, like, you kind of built out your niche as like servicing that cohort.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, your comment reminds me of a skit that was on The Daily Show years ago, where the editor of the New York Times, whose name escaped me right now, was interviewed by the Daily Show correspondent, and he says, "How is this business model of selling old news going?" and he points to the newspaper, and he's like, the editor is kind of befuddled, but he points to the newspaper, and he says, "Everything in there happened yesterday."
Yeah.
And so to take that to the extreme, as much as I love, Playbook from Politico, which Mike Allen was instrumental in creating, when I read Playbook this morning, as I do every morning, about 85-90% of those stories that they linked to were already on Political Wire from the previous day. And so what I'm really serving is that, and this is what's interesting about creating an audience, is that I have an audience of political junkies who literally have Political Wire up in a browser window all day, who return to it multiple times a day and hit refresh so they can see what's going on and they can see what they need to know. And I've kind of fixed, I've given them that hit that they need of okay, so now I'm up to date on what at least Taegan thinks is important in politics and what I should be paying attention to. And so that's really what I serve. And so if in terms of the ideology of that, it's really more focused towards, here's what I think is important in politics. And, what has happened naturally in this era that we live in is that, like Steve or like, Charlie Sykes at the Bulwark, I am much less interested in these things that have kind of gone outside bounds of what I think is proper political discourse, and so I really try to focus myself on, and so much of Donald Trump's movement has kind of gone outside of the bounds of what I think is legitimate, political activity. And so I am biased against that, but in terms of being biased towards Republicans or Democrats, I'm much less so that way.
Yeah.
I'm much more interested in just trying to tell my readers, here's what I think is important right now.
So drilling down to the business aspect, as much as you guys want to adhere to the center, the unfortunate fact is the hyper-partisan media has caused kind of like especially in the last few years, this kind of hyper-focus from brands on brand safety, keeping their logos and their brands away from controversial content. And so a lot of them have been steering advertising dollars away from political media by often using like keyword block lists, so that they're not even specifically excluding you if you have even a remotely political sounding word somewhere in your article, like the ads won't appear. That Taegan, you've been a longtime user of programmatic advertising. What have you noticed? Do you feel like your yield, your CPM has gone down as a result? As a result? And Steve, I know you guys have a different philosophy on advertising. We'll get into that in a second. But Taegan, in terms of just the programmatic, what have you noticed in recent years in terms of, CPMs and monetization with political media?
Yeah, it's not really impacted me at all. And I think that has a little bit to do with how I go about doing what I do. Is I'm not trying to build a shock audience. I'm not trying to throw up stories that throw up posts that I hope will go viral on social media, things like that. That's not me. I'm probably not very good at it either. But also, more importantly to me, is that's just, I used to, every once in a while in the early days, I would get a link from the Drudge Report. And like, you'd be like, oh, this is terrific. You get a link from the Drudge Report. You get literally millions of people come by your site and literally nobody's stuck. And
yeah,
it was always some outrage piece that that somehow caught his eye, and I get all this traffic. But
I was at US News and World Report in 2011 or 12, and just the obsession with just getting linked on Drudge was just so disheartening.
Yeah,
because they were just writing stories that were just Drudge bait.
Exactly. And you
Literally, yeah.
The bottom line though is it doesn't help you build a long-term business, and it doesn't you don't build a long-term audience. The people I want are the people who literally come across Political Wire, discover it, find out that I share a lot of their passions for what is happening in our political sphere and in public affairs right now, and that they start keeping it open in a browser tab. And that's the reader that I want. And so literally on any given month, 85 to 90% of my traffic is repeat visitors.
But what about the programmatic side? Like, has that just the keyword blocking and stuff? Has that hurt you at all?
No, it has not hurt me, mainly because I use a firm called Mediavine for programmatic ads, and they are an exceptional firm in terms of their ability to stay away from content that has any of those connotations. As a result, I'm actually the only political website of any size that they represent.
Oh, wow.
And so, and I actually had a discussion with their founders when I first, contacted them, and they went through a very long due diligence process about Political Wire. They liked the traffic, but they didn't want to do anything that was going to end up hurting, their overall ability to represent, their network of sites to advertisers. And so anyway, Political Wire made the cut, mainly because that, that's not what my goal is. My goal is not to shock. My goal is not to, my goal is simply to build a very loyal audience of political junkies.
Yeah. Steve, when you launched the Dispatch, you weren't necessarily anti-advertising, because you always kind of issued the caveat that we will probably want to introduce advertising at some point, but you use subscriptions as your North Star. How has your thinking on advertising evolved? I'm guessing you don't do any programmatic or anything like that. What's the approach to sponsorships, advertising, stuff like that?
Yeah, you're exactly right. At this point, all we do is we do some programmatic on our podcasts, but we don't have any advertising on our website, any ads or sponsorships in our newsletter. And you've characterized my approach to this exactly the right way. When we first launched, we knew we wanted to launch with an emphasis on pushed content, meaning newsletters and podcasts. And there was, we had long conversation about not having a website at all, but eventually thought it was a good place to build community, which is sort of the third pillar of what we're doing, but also a place to archive our newsletters and podcasts. So we ended up launching with a website, but as we were going about exploring that possibility, we talked to the three co-founders of Substack. And this was very early in their evolution. I think when we had this conversation with them on my back porch at my house, I believe that they were the only three employees, or maybe the first three, and they didn't have many others. And our three co-founders got together. We talked about all of this stuff. We just basically wanted to have a conversation to learn about newsletters and to learn about what they were doing. We didn't have any expectation that we would work with them or launch with them. And then they reached back out to us a couple of weeks later and said, we're thinking about trying to develop media companies, trying to launch media companies on Substack. Would you be interested in being our guinea pig if we built everything for you? And we said we were in the process of trying to hire a CTO and some developers. Yeah. We said immediately, yes, that would be great.
And but Substack is famously anti-advertising. Right. Like they look the other way, like they allow you to have advertisers, but so far their positioning has been, we will do nothing to help you on that front.
Exactly. And that's what they said to us, because we had long conversations internally about, we thought that we would launch with what we described at the time as tasteful sponsorships. We would be very careful about who we would associate with, particularly as we were growing the thing. And we talked to them a lot about it. And they finally said to us, look, why don't you give this a shot? We think you're going to be more successful than you guys do at building this foundation of reader revenue. So try that. Let's see how it works, and then come back and talk to us if you're not satisfied with how it goes. And they were right. We grew quickly, and we were very grateful, frankly, that we were able to build that foundation of reader revenue and build it quickly without having to resort to the kind of gimmicks that I think advertising-based publications sometimes do to get eyeballs. We posted this thing on the day we launched, and we told people This is not a place for hot takes. This is not a place to be told that everything you believe about the world is correct. You should come here with the expectation that we challenge our own assumptions, we'll challenge your assumptions. And while we come sort of broadly from the center right, we're not a partisan outfit. We're not going to be supportive of the Republican Party. We're going to report on reality as reality exists as best we can determine. And then we're going to grapple with it. And we can have big bloody policy fights about what to do, but we're going to start with a basic understanding of reality and facts. And it really, as I said, it really worked for us. We were glad we do it. We are now, as you mentioned, Simon, we left Substack last fall, had a great relationship with them. I still admire the heck out of what those folks have built. Part of our reasoning was we wanted to begin experimenting with ads and sponsorships. We're not quite there. We're still working through exactly how to do that, but I anticipate that that's something that we'll be trying out here in the coming months.
Well, Crooked Media, which is a left of center podcast network that's somewhat similar in kind of, approach, they've proven that they can bring in mainstream advertisers, even though they're a political outlet. In your testing of the waters, do you think a center right can also bring in mainstream non-political advertisers?
As it happens, you've put your finger on exactly the big question as we take these steps. We've had conversations with a number of people with vast experience in the advertising world, in particular as we prepare for the run up to the 2024 election cycle. And some of them are, actually most of them I would say are on the center right. They come from big media organizations that we all would recognize. And they've been sort of blunt with us about that as a potential challenge for the dispatch. They say most of the people who work in this industry are not center right. They come with suspicions of people on the center right. And we think that that will be an additional obstacle that you'll have to overcome. I think particularly as, many media outlets that are sort of expressly center right have flirted with, shall we say, conspiracies and pushing news that's not checked. Are we sort of lumped in with those sites and sort of have this additional suspicion? I'm hopeful that's not the case when we get to the point where we're actually having these conversations and we can say to people, actually, we're really brand safe, and we're not brand safe because we've designed ourselves that way, but we're brand safe because this is our editorial mission. This is what we're doing editorially, and we're credible and fact-based and not looking to simply get people angry about what they're seeing.
And when you do kind of start introducing more sponsorships, you think it's mainly going to be like native advertising, host read ads, maybe like a blurb or something in the newsletter or something to that effect?
Exactly. All of those things I would say are on the table. Our biggest concern, and of course, this is not new for the dispatch. This has been a challenge, I think, for people in our world for a long time. We really do believe what we've said about the user experience. We get a lot of feedback from our members and even our free readers that they love this. They love not having to sort of click through the autoplay ads and the obtrusive pop-ups and all of this stuff. And it just makes it a lot easier to come and get good information. We take that pretty seriously. We don't want to introduce that stuff. So if there's a way to both allow companies or brands to get their stuff in front of our readers and our potentially our members while not sort of harassing our members to pay attention, that feels like the sweet spot for us.
Cool. So I want to move on to subscriptions and memberships, but before I do, does anybody have any questions about advertising, anything like that before we move on to that? Jeff?
I'll ask a quick question. So if you think about advertising, are you thinking of hiring your own advertising people to reach out direct to potential advertisers, or go through like agencies? Sounds like you were talking to agencies more than direct sales.
Yeah, I think the short answer to that is both. We moved from Stitcher to Spotify. We moved our podcast operation from Stitcher to Spotify, which allows us the opportunity of more direct sales. Okay. And so we've begun approaching people.
Why is that?
Stitcher wasn't I mean, just to be blunt, wasn't terribly friendly about that. We had people approach us who said, "Hey, we'd really like to advertise on your podcast," but we had to sort of run all that through Stitcher, and they just weren't as responsive as we wanted to be. And with Spotify, there's a better economic arrangement, and they've encouraged us to do this. So we've sort of started out by going back to the people who had approached us before and said, "We'd really like to advertise on your podcast. Can we?" And we've gone back to them and said, "Yes, we'd love to have you." And we're sort of at the beginning stages of reaching out to other brands and other folks who we think would be a good fit with what we do. So that's what we're doing in the podcast space, and we're still really at the very beginning stages of figuring out what we're going to do on the textual side. We know, for instance, what a place like Axios does in sponsorship revenue, or POC, which is relatively new, but still having quite a bit of success there. And, as I say, we want to be careful. We're taking these steps cautiously. We're well aware of how much revenue we've left on the table over the past couple of years by not doing this, but we want to do it in a smart way. We want to do it in a methodical way. We anticipate that we'll have sort of detailed conversations with agencies. We're just at the beginning stages of that, but that's how we'd like to grow, slow and smart if we can.
And Taegan, you're just a one-man band, so I'm guessing you love to just outsource all that stuff to Mediavine.
I like to stay as efficient as possible, but there's also another thing in terms of my business model is that I have one of the benefits of membership. So when you sign up for a membership, monthly or annual, I show you no advertising at all. You get actually a very different website. It's very clean. It's got new features. It's got additional writing. It's got different features on the website, but it's also got no advertising at all. And so that is a benefit. And so my most important readers, the ones who are paying me directly, part of the arrangement is that I don't show them ads. And for me to, break that arrangement, it would have to be pretty compelling. That the advertising would have to be really pretty much exactly stuff that they want anyway, and that I'm adding value to their experience. Otherwise, I think I like the arrangement that I have, and so I'm not really interested in monetizing, some of the drive-by traffic, aside from using programmatic advertising. Could I, again, like Steve said, am I leaving money on the table? Almost assuredly. But I'm always experimenting. I'm always looking at different things. But right now, I like the arrangement I have.
So this is the perfect transition to talking about memberships and subscriptions. I know Jeff has a question, but I just want to start out with just one quick one for Steve. Is you did something that I think a lot of media companies, creators don't really think about, is before you launched a traditional subscription, you did something like a founding membership or something like that. Can you talk about like what that strategy was and how you actually raised? That was almost like your startup capital in some ways. So it was almost like a VC fund unofficially, kind of. So talk about what you did there.
Yeah, with a VC help from the beginning without the demands of venture capitalists.
Yeah.
I mean, we raised some money before we launched in sort of a traditional way, not venture capital money, but from outside investors. And then in the lead up to our launch, I think we understood pretty early that there would be a group of people who would be very enthusiastic about our mission, about the sort of reporting focused, fact focused mission that we launched with, and would be willing to help us sort of help jumpstart our efforts. So I had a conversation with a guy, really smart media entrepreneur in Italy, who had launched sort of a Politico for Italy. And he talked to me about how he had created these founder memberships at launch and how successful they'd been for his company. And we had conversations internally about how to do it and what to do, and thought through pricing. And I would love to be able to tell you that we enlisted sophisticated outside consultants to give us exactly the right dollar amount for the prices, but we didn't. We just guessed. And we set our founding memberships at $1,500, lifetime memberships. They never pay again. And it's fair to say that we anticipated we'd get 2 dozen, maybe 3 dozen, which would just give us some some additional money to go and make some hires, and also signal to us how, whether we were right or not about the enthusiasm that we had. And I think within a couple months we had 300 or 400 of those.
Yeah.
And it,
So
and
it
it
was
really
like
worked.
it was like $500,000 of capital you had to play around with before you even launched, really.
It was, and we told everybody from the beginning that we wanted to grow deliberately. We did not want to sort of race ahead and get ahead of ourselves. We wanted to understand the environment as we grew, and we sort of insisted on that. But having that money was absolutely crucial in allowing us to. We were able to hire a few people, a few additional people than we had planned, earlier than we had planned, which in turn fueled additional growth. So it was absolutely crucial. And I see that there are a lot of people, in particular on Substack, who are doing something similar now, and I think meeting with similar results.
Mm-hmm. Jeff, you had a question about, conversions, like how they drove actual subscriptions.
Yeah, I think so. As a true startup, beyond the foundation members, how did you go and acquire your audience? And did you advertise? Did you, I'm just curious how you started to grow your readership list. And I guess my follow-on question I always have for newsletter people who have a mix of free and paid is, what do paid people get in your model that the average free reader does not get?
Yeah,
I'm
and
more
to
interested
kind of
in how you started. Go ahead, Simon.
and to contextualize it, I think like one advantage that Taegan and Steve had was, and Steve's co-founders as well, is they had these long-standing personal brands where they were creating free content for the better part of a decade or 20 years. And so there was kind of pent-up demand that the average new media entrepreneur who doesn't have that kind of thing, because like Taegan, when did you launch your membership? What year?
The membership was about almost 8 years ago.
Yeah, so like Taegan already had millions of monthly readers, so it wasn't like he needed to build up an initial audience. You probably saw a huge explosion right after you launched. Like, one of your best months was probably the month that you launched the membership, right, Taegan?
Interestingly enough, it was not. Interestingly, the best month that I've had was, or the best day that I've had was the day after Donald Trump was elected.
Oh, yeah.
And it was literally people in horror.
I think a lot of publishers' best day was the day after Donald Trump was elected.
Yeah, so what's interesting is I love Steve's idea. I wish I had even thought of it or known about it. But the idea of like a founding member, a founding membership is a fantastic idea, because you do have these fans, and then you have super fans, and those super fans will literally pay you. They value it so much. You'd love to be able to give them the opportunity to do that. And unfortunately, I never took advantage of that. So I think that's just a fantastic idea. And if I were doing it all over again, I would. But when I started, there was some trepidation actually about it. I wasn't entirely sure how this would be received. I didn't completely understand what is the value that I'm giving in return for this. And so the story is that my oldest son was a freshman in college. He goes to college about 4 hours away. I had not made plans for him to come home for Thanksgiving break. So I decided the day before I was going to go up and drive up, and I was going to go get him. In the 4-hour drive, I turned off the radio and I thought about this membership. How am I going to do it? What's it going to be? And all the rest. I got to a hotel room. I pulled out my laptop and I said, you know something, I'm doing it today. Turned it on about 10:30, 11 at night, shut down the laptop and went to sleep. And the next morning, I woke up with dozens and dozens of new members. And I was like, wow, I had no idea what the power of this would be. Because I had been doing this for so long, people's willingness to pay for things online had grown tremendously over that time. And I literally knew the morning I woke up, I said, this is going to be a winner. And, and then I just continued to, slowly try to define what the value was that you were getting, by subscribing. And, and I think it's a fairly, I've heard Steve speak on other podcasts about creating the bundle. creating a bundle of newsletters that you can offer, and I have done something very similar, is create a bundle of things that you get for this membership, not all of which you might like, but some of which you may, and it's been very successful to do that. The next step in all of this is for us to be able to kind of work together, for Political Wire and the Dispatch to be able to work together to create common bundles and to be able to have joint subscriptions. But none of the platforms are really there yet in terms of trying to help us do that easily.
So in terms of, what you put behind the paywall versus the free content, Steve, I know that the Dispatch for a few months was completely free, and then you had an official launch date of the subscription paywall. How did you differentiate? Because I remember us debating what should you put in front of the paywall, what should you put behind the paywall. What did you kind of come to realize was like that perfect mix?
Well, yeah, I mean, and I'm not doing this to just to just offer you praise on your discussion, but really the sort of central insight from the conversations that we had with you was you wanted to make very clear to people who weren't paying what they weren't getting, and create this FOMO. So what we did, we had Jonah Goldberg was my co-founder, a very popular writer, had his own following. And Jeff, to answer your question, I think one of the things that we did from the outset was we did have people with sort of our own followings on Twitter, and Jonah and I were both on Fox at the time. And while we were certainly moving in a different direction than most of primetime Fox was headed, there were, I think, a good number of Fox viewers who didn't like where primetime Fox was headed and were looking for something closer to what we were providing. So we were able to leverage Twitter and some early PR hits about what we were doing to help us build our list and then try to monetize. But in terms of the free versus paid, I don't want to let me not pretend that I've got this figured out, right? I don't. This is a constant battle for us. I think it's a battle for it's a battle for big traditional media companies who spend tens of millions of dollars on it. And it's a challenge for startups to figure out what exactly the right balance is, because we wanted to create enough interest in our free stuff to serve as the top of the funnel, as it were. But we also want people to pay us. And our original conception was to sort of flip what many publications were doing in the newsletter space on its head. So most places who were building out newsletter programs at the time, traditional media outlets, were offering their newsletters for free for those things to serve as top of the funnel and driving people to the paid, a gated website, paywall, what have you. We wanted to make the newsletters the premium content. So we, especially launching on Substack, knew that we were going to try to use the free website to publish really good work, fact-checking work that we do, which brings in a lot of readers, reported pieces, commentary and analysis, and drive them to the gated newsletters. And so that's what we did really for 3 years, and it seems to have worked. But like I said, I don't want to pretend like we've got it all figured out. Before I joined this call, we had a robust hour-long discussion about exactly how we're balancing these things and whether we're leaning too far in one direction, leaning too far in another. So it's an ongoing conversation.
So to translate what you're saying, like if you published a long form magazine like piece, that would probably be free, because that's kind of the top of the funnel, because that's what people are going to share on social media, that will get them really engaged. But your kind of newsletter, which is probably a little bit more choppy and kind of bite-sized nuggets within it, that's what's behind the paywall.
Yeah, I mean, some of the newsletters are really long. Like if you look at a typical Jonah Goldberg G file, and he's got this rabid cult-like following for this newsletter. It is choppy. Like he has different sections where he gets into different things, or he tees up an argument that he takes 2,000 words to get to. But his people love that. And what we've told our members and free readers from the beginning is to expect that we're going to provide depth, context, and understanding. So they shouldn't come to us if they want the kind of Axios style content that Axios provides and that others provide. So we sort of tell them in advance, like, hey, you can expect this. But I think one of the things that really distinguishes the newsletters from the free content on the website is the tone. and the way that the newsletters are written. The newsletters, and we've done this deliberately from the beginning, are meant to feel like an email that you'd get from a friend. So
Yeah.
what we say sometimes to our newsletter readers is pretend you've got a really smart friend who's in the Peace Corps in Kenya and isn't paying attention to the day-to-day of whatever the subject is. You know, we've got an economics and trade newsletter writer who's fantastic. We've got a, politics newsletter. We've got all these different newsletters right for that person. So you should not take shortcuts. You shouldn't use acronyms. You shouldn't use only last names of political figures that these people might not know. Instead, you should take the time to explain it, walk people through it in sort of a big picture way that will be accessible to non-DC insiders, but at the same time, write it like you would write an email to your friend. Don't write it like AP style, and we don't want the stilted stuff at the beginning. If you've got a joke, give it a shot. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. So there's a very different tone, I would say, between how we do our newsletters and what we do on the website, even though some of the pieces we publish on the website are more conversational than you'd find on a typical news website.
Taegan, what's your sweet spot? Sorry, Matt, just let's just get to Taegan in terms of what you offer members.
Well, I think it's best. So I think it's best summarized by the fact a reader years ago called me the crack dealer for political junkies. Mm-hmm. And so what I do is just like a crack dealer, as I give somebody their first hit is free. And they get a taste of what I'm offering here. And if you're truly a political junkie, you're going to come to Political Wire, and the sales pitch is pretty easy. You can see what it is. It's a continuously updating scroll of what is important in politics. And what I then offer as members, if you're really interested in this, what I told my members, that when I started the membership is I used to write pieces for The Week and for the Daily Beast and other publications in order, and I justified them to myself that I was promoting Political Wire because there might be a link to Political Wire in my bio and who I was. The reality is that I don't think that mattered one bit. And so what I told my members is if you want to see what I'm going to write, it's only for members. And so I give my own analysis of what I think is happening in politics for members. Like I said before, I also drop all the advertising, for members who are logged in. I have a trending news page. If you're really a junkie, it updates, literally every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day, in terms of here's the latest feed of all political news. I have a podcast with Chris Rebeck, who's here on the call. It drops every Friday, and we discuss what has happened that week. And then I've also created this bundle with outside newsletter publishers, one called Inside Elections, which used to be called the Rothenberg Political Report, and the other called Ballot Access News, which is by a gentleman out in California. And these are, pretty hardcore, newsletters for people who follow politics closely. There's a few other things that I throw in there, but that's pretty much what I offer. So the experience, very few people, I have a very low churn rate. I'm very fortunate because the experience, once you become a member, once you come behind the paywall, is much, much nicer. And what happens if you let your membership lapse is all of a sudden the advertising comes back on your screen. You're not getting these posts. And so people re-up pretty quickly when, if their credit card expired or something like that, because if they are regular readers of Political Wire, that's the experience that they want. It's just a nicer experience.
Oh gosh, I wish we weren't coming up at the end of the hour because I'd want to go deep on the bundle. Matt, what's your question?
Steve, this is all super interesting. Just on those initial $1,500 members, what was your pitch to them, and what benefits were you kind of offering them in terms of, I don't know, access to you and Jonah or anything else?
It's a great question. And again, I wish I could give you a more sophisticated answer or something that makes us look smarter. We basically told them you should do this if you want us to succeed. Full stop. We didn't offer them additional access. We didn't offer them special meetings or special newsletters. We didn't really do anything for them at the beginning. I think in some cases we sort of talked about providing a lifetime members tier. so that we would have some calls. And in fact, we've done some of that. It hasn't been terribly strategic, to be blunt about it. But we've used them as in some ways as a focus group for some of the other things we're doing. So we do a weekly streaming show every Tuesday night at 8 o'clock called Dispatch Live. And it's basically just an extended conversation with reporters and editors. Most of it focused on the news or focused on some of the things we've published over the preceding couple of days. And when we were building that out or trying to figure out if it would work, I think, did 2 or 3 of those with them and said, hey, can you help us figure out if this works and where we're smart and not smart and how we can improve it. And it was extraordinarily helpful to have them do that. We've given them, I think, early access to some of our events. We had a big conference planned for the weekend after the election in Florida. Incredible set of speakers, great panels, 3-day thing down in Naples, Florida, and then Hurricane Ian hit the hotel.
Oh gosh.
So our plan to do events didn't really work in that instance, and the hotel told us they couldn't accommodate us any longer. But we had given them sort of early access to tickets there, things like that. But it wasn't, I mean, again, just being totally candid about it, it wasn't like we designed some very sophisticated value proposition, one or the other. We just said, if you really believe in this mission, we hope you'll help us push it forward.
Do you still sell the lifetime memberships?
We do. We're probably going to end it. We talked about ending it at the 3-year mark. We're just past the 3-year mark now. At some point, we're not going to do it anymore. We'll probably make a big final push and then call it a day over the summer and the fall.
Well, there you go, Taegan. It's never too late. You could, especially if you're willing to or wanting to launch some kind of new vertical or something like that. You can use that as the excuse to sell founding memberships, so you can hire someone or something to that effect.
Well, Simon, once again, your office hours calls have been helpful because I've written down that idea. So,
well, I am super sad because we didn't even hit the tip of the iceberg. Chris, did you have a quick question?
No, I was just going to recommend that Taegan take that money and shovel it to his podcast partner.
So, yeah, we didn't even hit the tip of the iceberg in the questions I wanted to get to. I wanted to ask Steve about his decision to leave Substack. And then I also wanted to ask both of you a bunch of questions about podcasting, but unfortunately we're up at the end of the hour. I want to respect both of your times. You both have audiences that you have to go back and serve, but thank you so much for doing this. My audience really appreciates it, both the live audience and the many people who are going to watch it at home. And thank you so much, everybody. I don't know what my next office hours is going to be about, but it's going to have another amazing lineup of guests. I'm always incredibly flattered and flabbergasted by the people who agree to come on to these, because they're so much more successful than I am. And so super appreciative. Thank you so much, Stephen, Taegan.
Thanks for having me, Simon. Appreciate it. Good to talk with you,
Simon.
David.
All right.
Take
Have
care.
a great rest of your day, everybody.
Bye.